Hello, I'm Cassie. If you didn't know, April is National Poetry Month, and because we're in April, I thought this would be a really good time to share some of my favorite horror poetry recommendations. So this is going to be a list of my favorite horror poetry books, and what I mean by horror poetry is that a lot of them involve blood or creepy things like ghouls or demons or witches. They're not necessarily like Halloween-y or anything like that, but they deal with things like being a woman and dealing with personal demons and like love, loss, basically everything else that normal poetry contains, but from a darker lens. So it's a little bit darker, it's a little bit more horror-y, it's a little bit more bloody, a little bit more gory, and I like it a lot. So if you need any qualifications or anything like that, I don't know. I've been reading poetry basically my whole life. When I was little, I would basically read anything that I could get my hands on, and a lot of the time what I could get my hands on was poetry. So I've been reading it since I was a kid, and it wasn't until I became like into the whole like bookish community online that I realized that horror or dark poetry was a thing. Like, I knew that there were like some older poetries that were like, you know, gothic poetry and stuff like that, but I didn't know that like modern writers were doing that same thing. So I got very excited and I basically like dove in head first, and I've read so many now. I've read a lot of them, and I had a little bit of difficulty, but I managed to narrow it down to 7 of my favorite horror poetry collections. So these are all single author collections. So I'm going to go into a little bit about each collection, but I'm not going to say too much because they're pretty short, and poetry and horror are both very subjective, and I don't want to give too much away or say too much of what I think to influence what anybody else thinks about it. But I do recommend all of these, like highly. They are my absolute favorites in the genre. Okay, so the first recommendation I have for you is I Am Not Your Final Girl, and this is one of my absolute top tier favorite poetry collections of all time. This is also a really good collection if you're just a fan of horror in general, because this collection focuses on the women in different horror films. So each poem is from the perspective or having to do with one of the main characters or even a side character that is a woman from various different horror things. And you can tell that the author really loves horror herself, because there are so many things in here that, like, even smaller, like lesser known movies that like maybe you haven't seen before or you don't know very many other people who have seen, she'll do a character from that. And it's so interesting because you can read these from the lens of the character themselves, but there are also so many things in here that you can apply to yourself and make this more of like an introspective read, as well as being able to appreciate the actual characters and the actual things that they're from. This is just a lot of fun. I do highly recommend it if you're into horror, if you like horror movies, even if you think you're like not a huge fan of poetry, which if that's true, I'm not sure why you're watching this video, unless you're just trying to give it a chance. And if that's the case, I definitely recommend this one. So good. This is also, a lot of them actually on this list, but this is also like a very feminist focused collection. So there's a lot of stuff about just like being a woman, and I mean, given that they are women in the horror movies, it is focused on like what it's like being that woman. And as we know, sometimes historically in horror, women are not always treated well. They're not always handled like their characterization with care or with like accuracy. So I think having this collection is like really cool and really interesting, and I love it. So good. The next one is another favorite. These are all favorites, so I'm just gonna stop saying that. But this is Love for Slaughter, and this one is where it starts getting a little bit gory, a little bit more bloody, a little bit darker. This has to do with like love, lust, loss, lots of different L words actually. Again, there's a lot of like graphic stuff in this one, and if you're okay with that, I would definitely recommend it, but just kind of go into it with like the warning of that, just in case you're a little squeamish or anything. And then if you like this, I would also highly recommend To Be Devoured, which is the same author, but it's a novella, and it's a horror novella, and it's one of my favorites. It is messed up. There's some stuff in there that happens that I will never forget. It's so good. It's so wild. But this is not a novella recommendation video. This is poetry. So read this poetry collection. It's very good. I love it. This next one is actually one of the very first horror poetry collections that I read. And it is called Choking Back the Devil. And I love this one. This is a little bit different. It's still very dark, but it focuses a little bit more on like personal demons. And It also deals with like mental health, just different things about yourself that you struggle with, but the author kind of like turns those into like actual like monsters and scary nightmarish things. And I really love that. I love being able to read somebody expressing the same things that I feel in a more like eloquent, beautiful way. So that's one reason that I really love poetry, but that's specifically one reason why I really like this one, because a lot of the mental health stuff in here is stuff that I find very relatable. And so reading some of that and being able to see it like in such a nice way, it's just like, wow, yeah, I feel that, you know, like I really feel that. So I love this one. I've reread this one a couple of times, and you can't see it because all my books are packed, but this one actually is one of my most annotated books as well, because I have a lot of tabs sticking out of this one. And then we have the Apocalyptic Mannequin, and this is really cool because this is very dark and horror-y, but it's also a little bit like dystopian and like sci-fi. It's like end of the world stuff, but like also feminist dark horror and like blood, and I don't know, it's kind of like magical but also kind of like creepy, and I don't know, it's just so cool. There are so many poems in this one too that I really loved, so I would be hard pressed to pick a favorite. And this is another one that I have completely annotated the heck out of. And this author also has a bunch of other poetry collections, and she actually I think like teaches like witch lit classes and maybe like a witchy poetry or witchy literature class or something. Just as a disclaimer, a lot of the people that I'm mentioning I do know as well. That doesn't bias me at all on their writing, but I can personally say they're fantastic, including Stephanie, the author of this one. She's very passionate about like the witchy aspects of things, and she incorporates a lot of that sort of stuff into her writing, which I just love. It's so good. This is one of my favorite collections. They're all my favorite collections, I know. Stop. I need to stop saying that. And next up is a really unique one, and this is actually a blackout poetry collection. So if you don't know what blackout poetry is, it's basically where you make poetry from words that are already there, like a page from a book or something that you find on the ground, you know, like in this case, A Complex Accident of Life. This one is done with blackout poetry using Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. All of the poems from this come from actual Frankenstein pages, and I think that is so cool. Because it adds like an extra depth. Like if you really love Mary Shelley's story already, then being able to read it and recognize a couple of the lines and being like, oh, like is this where this is happening? Like, but having it in a totally different lens. So it's got a whole new meaning now, but it's still a little bit familiar to what you already know. I don't know. I just think that's really cool. Not all of them are even like that, because a lot of them just stand alone. Like I wouldn't be able to tell where in the book or what page it was from, but the poem has like nothing to do with Frankenstein, but it's still very relatable and very pretty. So I don't know, this is just, it's such a cool collection. And this author actually, if you like this one, this author actually also has another blackout poetry collection that I've read, and I love both. It was a little bit difficult to decide which one to put here because I really love both, but I decided with this one, I think, because it's just Frankenstein, so it seemed more like on brand with the rest of the video. But yeah, recommend both of them. I recommend all of her books in like, because she writes fiction and stuff as well, and short stories, so yeah. And the next up, this is actually one that I read more recently than some of the others on the list, and this is The Saint of Witches. And I really liked this one because this one, some of the other ones that I've mentioned have a little bit of a focus on like motherhood and being a mom and stuff, like how your body is sometimes like no longer your own and stuff like that. I can't relate to any of that. I don't have children. I don't particularly want them at this point, so I think it was really cool because this collection in particular has some rep for that. Like if there are other people out there who do not have children and have no real desire to procreate and make children, there are a couple of things here for you. And I think that's really cool because there's not a lot of stuff that I find that in. And that's not to say like there's anything bad about like motherhood or wanting babies or anything like that. So I don't want anybody to feel like I'm like shaming them or anything. But it's just like a personal thing that I appreciated in this one. And this also has like a lot of a focus on witchiness, obviously, but magic in general, and also like gender and gender norms, and it's very interesting, and also like sexuality, and I liked this one a lot. I think I split this one into 2 different readings. Like I read the first half and then I read the second half, and I enjoyed it. I'm probably going to reread it so I can reread it straight through, because that is how I like to read poetry usually, with a collection. But I believe I've actually read a couple of poems or short fiction maybe that this author wrote and like was published online that I was able to read like on a website or whatever, from them sharing it on Twitter. So I'm definitely going to look into more from them because I really like this, so I'm sure I'll like other stuff too. And then the last poetry book on this list is another more recent release, and that's Escaping the Body. And I really like this one because it's not quite as dark as the others, but I still believe that it feels like solidly in the horror realm. And this one's kind of like, it's got like space stuff, it's got like magic stuff, it's got dark stuff. There are some bits of this one that are a little bit more experimental, like in terms of the format of the poems or the length of the poems. But overall, like I really like this one because it has like this melancholic sort of like 3 a.m. listening to lo-fi vibe, you know? Like, I don't know. It's a really good vibe that I really like, and probably one of my favorite vibes, honestly. And this just nailed it. It was so good. Highly recommend. Okay, so there you have it. Those are my 7 horror poetry collection recommendations. I hope that you found something new here that you maybe haven't heard before and you find it and you really love it. I know I did mention a few other recommendations alongside those, but if you like any of these books, the authors do write other stuff, so definitely look into that. They might also be in like anthologies and stuff where there are multiple authors, so you might even find more stuff there, stuff that I wasn't able to recommend or don't even know about. So yeah, if you have any recommendations for like a dark horror poetry book or author to check out, I would love that, especially if it's like focused on like a witchy or like a feminist lens, because I do really relate to those sorts of things. I am what I am. Okay, well, thank you for hanging out with me, and I hope you like this video. I will see you in the next one. Bye.